This session is designed to look at the Civil War. Yesterday we focused on the conventional phase, the first phase. But in some ways, it's more interesting when it breaks down into a guerrilla warfare. Many, many years ago, I remember talking about this with the late Commandant Peter Young of Archives. And we were talking about the structure of the War of Independence. And he described, as Peter would, he described the IRA at the time as a set of local warlords who operated completely independently of GHQ, who did things their own way when they wanted. And the loyalty of each brigade was to the brigadier. Now, you could argue that there was an element of exaggeration in that, and that also during the War of Independence, as the war progressed, there was a determined effort made by GHQ to try and establish some element of control over the local brigades. Ernie O'Malley echoed that in his On Another Man's Wound, where he starts a chapter and he simply says, every county was different. And he should have known, because of his job as a GHQ organiser, he actually functioned in a total of something like 16 counties during the War of Independence. So he would have known every county was different. And I would suggest that was even more true of the Civil War. Every county was different. The local brigadier was the key guy, rather than Liam Lynch, and as Ewan described so eloquently yesterday, scribbling messages, handing it to somebody who smuggled it and tried to get the message around the country. So on the theme that every county was different, we've assembled a very distinguished panel to look at 4 very different counties. Tomás will look at Clare. Aaron will look at Wexford. Donal, who has looked at Louth and at South Armagh. And, it's this idea, every county was different, is so critical to it. Now, there's one element of housekeeping that I want to impress upon our speakers. Today is Heritage Day in the barracks here, and it's a family day. So we have to be very tight as regards lunch, because we're in competition with the families, and they'll get preference. So we'd ask people that the idea is that each of our speakers will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes about their individual counties, and then we will have, subject to time, etc., a discussion where we can discuss this whole concept, every county was different. So with that, who wants to start off? Tomás? Yep, over to you.
Pat, I already feel the weight of responsibility of being the first speaker, because that'll affect everything that comes afterwards, but I'll take the full 20 minutes and no more, Pat. The lads will get that presentation up and going, but I suppose what I want to say first of all, I'm obviously going to talk about County Clare in the context of the Civil War, the reaction to the treaty, the lead up to the Civil War, and I suppose how it manifested within the county. I do want to make the point, though, that I think sometimes we measure activity or the experience of the Civil War according to figures, according to how many were killed, how many ambushes took place, or what side particular individuals took. And of course, they are factors in the analysis, but I do think it's beneficial to go much deeper into the experience within a county and to see how the legacy of that affects the place, to get a full rounded feeling of the experience in any one county. So certainly zooming down into a county by county analysis is very, very worthwhile in that context. So first of all, in terms of the treaty context, on the left-hand side you see a very faded photograph, but it's quite significant in terms of what happened subsequently. It's a photograph of De Valera during a visit to County Clare during the period leading up to the signing of the treaty, and you see him in cordial conversation with Micheál Brennan. Certainly, even 3 months later, the conversations had stopped between those two men, but it is an example of, again, how quickly things began to change. During that visit, De Valera made no explicit reference to the treaty, but made some subtle comments with regard to the maintaining of principles, which I don't know in the context of what happens afterwards, what he was predicting, but certainly he was reinforcing that narrative that County Clare would be a place that would stay strong if others didn't. The reaction to the treaty in County Clare, again, at a surface level, is quite positive. The Sinn Féin East Clare executive, on the proposal of T.V. Honan, who was a significant Sinn Féiner, supports the treaty. The West Clare executive, similarly, 17 to, I think it's 9, abstain, 17-0 vote in favour of the treaty. But again, looking at it only a matter of weeks later after the Dáil vote, the Sinn Féin executive continues to be in favour, but now T.V. Honan had switched to an anti-treaty position. The West Clare executive then has turned entirely against the treaty and voted 29-6. So again, this is an example of the levels of confusion within the county as people try to grapple with what is being proposed. It is mirrored across the county in terms of public bodies being supportive. The Clare Unionist Club, Clare Farmers Club, the Locomotive and Firemen Association, etc., are all in favour of the treaty. And these are public bodies, public pronouncements. But again, I repeat, there is always a need to measure the feeling underneath as distinct from the public declarations and pronouncements. While this is happening, there is still violence, as a residue of the War of Independence in County Clare. Sergeant David Fenley is shot dead in Innis in reprisal for his involvement in the torture and killing of Shanahan and McNamara in December of 1920. 2 Black and Tans are killed in Listowel Varna after leaving a public house in February of 1922 as well, in reprisal for bombs that were thrown at children in Ennistimon as the British forces left the town. So there is that residual violence that is spilling over into the period of confusion. I want to talk very briefly about one of the key dynamics of the Civil War in County Clare in terms of how the dividing line appeared. There are a number of statements that I believe are quite significant, even going back to the 21st of November 1921, when Patrick Brennan, Micheál's older brother, refers to that makes the point that the volunteer organisation is not the master of the people in the county, and refers to a certain volunteer officer. The volunteer officer that he's referring to is Frank Barrett, and that is evidence of a tension that is building and building, and it actually existed throughout the whole revolutionary period between the Brennans and the Barretts, and in my view becomes the most significant factor in the way in which the division militarily within County Clare takes place, is that division. But still, in December, on the 3rd, as I mentioned earlier, Micheál Brennan and Frank Barrett, as the leaders of the Mid Clare and East Clare brigades, both meet with him and De Valera when he comes to visit the county. But to follow on that context of the Brennan-Barrett divide, there is this anecdote that I've recorded in many different ways, which I think is useful, and far be it from me to downplay oral history and the accuracy of it, but in one story told to me by a relation of Micheál Brennan, he's on a train on the way to Dublin where leading IRA officers are making a decision as to how they'll vote on the treaty, and when he realises that Barrett is on the same train, he asks one of his men to go and ask him which way he's going. He establishes that Brennan is going against the treaty, to which he then decides, right, I'm against it. Now, I've recorded that in the opposite direction as well, in Barrett making his decision on the basis of where Brennan is standing. But it's symptomatic and it's anecdotal of the division and the very real bitterness that existed. Brennan himself accepted that we spent more time fighting amongst ourselves than the enemy. Dick Mulcahy complained constantly about the division between the Mid and East Clare Brigades and the Brennans and the Barretts. So this is an undercurrent that is constantly in existence with regard to the Civil War in County Clare. February becomes more and more volatile to the point where Micheál Brennan issues a curfew. There's a scramble for barrack control, as there is in most parts of the country. On the 26th of February, De Valera comes into the county for his first visit since the ratification of the treaty and is greeted by Frank Barrett. No Micheál Brennan on this occasion, so the dividing lines are becoming more and more apparent and evident. On the 9th of April, at the Army Convention, Frank Barrett is listed as one of the 16-member executive of the anti-treaty IRA Army Executive. So again, that firmly positions himself. The day after that, in Broadford in East Clare, the local barracks had been held by Free State personnel. The Republicans locally decided to take it over. As a response to that, this group of Free State soldiers were sent from 6 Mile Bridge to retake the barracks. During the scuffle, a 29-year-old Republican called William O'Brien was shot. And this, I suppose, arguably is the first Civil War casualty, or certainly Civil War-related casualty in County Clare, but again is evidence of increasing tension within the county. On the same week, there's a significant meeting in Ennis of senior Free State personnel, including Micheál Brennan, but you see Sean McCone, Arthur Griffith, Kevin O'Higgins, etc., and some of the more significant Free State figures like Canon Hamilton in County Clare. On the same, a week later, in the start of May, as in other parts of the country, there are bank raids throughout Ireland, and in Ennis, there's no different. A bank raid takes place in Bank Place, Ennis. £18,000 is taken by the anti-treaty IRA. It was a very casual affair, it seems, because the report suggested that during the course of the prolonged raid, people made lodgements and were not interfered with. The operation was merely a transfer of finance from one government to another. The actual bank manager was out for a walk, and one of the IRA men had to go out and tell him he was wanted and walk back casually with him, and then produce his revolver to take the money. Coincidentally, Paddy Con McMahon, for anybody who ever danced or was sufficiently old to dance back in maybe the 60s in Ennis, Paddy Con McMahon's hall is reputed to have benefited certainly from some of the funding that came from that bank raid, but that's not to be confirmed today. Now, the start of the Civil War proper, the first IRA volunteer to be killed in the Civil War was Joe Considine, who, with Paddy Con McMahon that I just mentioned, drove in to Dublin on the night the firing started on the forecourts and was shot in the head. Joe was from Clooney in East Clare, had originally been in the Civic Guard and then changed back to the anti-treaty position, but he was shot, it would seem, by Clare members of the Free State Army who didn't realise who they were firing on, because Paddy Con McMahon wrote afterwards that he met Ignatius O'Neill immediately afterwards, and Ignatius O'Neill, who had taken a Free State position, explained that they didn't realise who they were firing on. At the funeral, and again just to show the interconnections across the experience, this isn't a photograph of Joe Considine's funeral in Clooney. The man on the left-hand side is Con McMahon. 7 months later, he would be executed with another Clooney man, Paddy Hennessy, who I'll come back to a little bit later on. So meanwhile, as the Civil War kicks off properly, obviously, as you know, and I'm sure Padraig O'Rourke explained it yesterday very clearly, that Limerick became the centre ground. Micheál Brennan is now the head of the 1st Western Division. It replaces Frank Barrett again, which adds to the tension naturally. Frank Barrett becomes head of the anti-treaty Western Division. Limerick becomes so significant in the context of strategy. And again, some people would suggest that Clare didn't play a big role in the Civil War, but strategically, the actions that take place in Clare, the decision of Micheál Brennan to take the Free State position and the decision of almost all the East Clare Brigade to go with him to form effectively the 1st Western Division with South West and South East Galway is massively significant, because it is the only significant Free State force west of the Shannon. The Battle of Limerick takes place in July 1922, and when that results is successful for the Free State, during, I should say, that's Micheál Brennan again, during that period, the IRA and Clare are able to consolidate their positions in various barracks throughout the county. even in East Clare. But after the Limerick affair, the now very well-resourced First Western Division are able to turn their attention to County Clare and to targeting the IRA in the county. And really from the end of July or mid-July through to October, you see the intensity or the most intense period of fighting, and the most deaths take place in County Clare during that period. The IRA leave what is now the Garda Barrack in Ennis, which had been their headquarters, move out to Corrafin Barracks. Within a few weeks they leave that. That's seen as the battleground for County Clare. And you gradually see a retreat back towards Galway and back towards West Clare of the anti-treaty IRA, who are in an increasingly difficult position as the Free State intensify their attacks against them. Seamus Hennessy, a local Republican, wrote to Frank Barrett saying that he had a big difficulty in ambushing the pro-treaty IRA because the men were seeing fellas that they'd recognised. They were seeing Ignatius O'Neill, they were seeing John Joe Tosser Nealon, and were just not prepared to shoot on these men who they had fought in the War of Independence with. Add to that Frank Barrett's admission to Liam Lynch that he felt the people of Clare weren't with them, or at least weren't prepared to be with them in the context of the violence it was going to result in. Some significant moments happened throughout this period, including the death of Padre O'Loughlin on the right-hand side, who dies in Kilfenora in the home of the McCormicks, Katie McCormick on the left. He's a really significant figure. I believe his death was very controversial, which needs more attention. But he is the divisional adjutant of the First Western Division, and when he dies, it brings about a big change with regard to the discipline within the Mid-Clare IRA. Because he was somebody who tried to keep control of the IRA, tried to keep control of discipline within the force. And his death, I won't say unleashed a period of violence, but certainly led to, it didn't help with regard to discipline. Over the period of August, September and October, as I said, the most deaths within the Civil War in Clare take place, both with regard to Free State and anti-treaty. Some of them are exampled here. On the left-hand side, you have John O'Gorman and Patrick O'Dea, who both were killed in separate incidents. John O'Gorman was involved in an incident in Kildysert, where they attacked the barracks held by the Free State. Within that is the man in the bottom right-hand side, Jimmy O'Dea, who knew all these men. As they were attacking the barracks, they left a mine against the wall, which detonated prematurely and blew a hole in John O'Gorman's stomach. John McSweeney, whose funeral you see there in the other photographs, was also badly wounded. John O'Gorman, the man in the far left, is very severely wounded, and I documented a good amount of oral tradition with regard to his death in Mrs. Casey's in a place called Gurt Glass in Kildysert, and he died a very, very brutal and painful death. In October, just 2 months later, the man from the neighbouring house to Mrs. Casey's was killed in Tullycrine in a separate ambush on the Free State forces, which involved a man called T.J. Ryan, who was also in Kildysert and was also in Tullycrine. T.J. Ryan is also the man responsible for the Tullycrine box bomb of 1929. So all of these interconnections are happening all of the time. Free State forces are also being attacked, obviously, quite regularly during this period. This is a photograph of a man called Michael. Well, he was introduced to me as Michael Paddens Toohey, but in fact, his birth name was Michael O'Loughlin. And before he was born, his father was shot in the head in Lahinch, County Clare, as a member of the Free State Army. And I interviewed him about that and the effect on his own mother. And, I suppose the continual present absence, I suppose, that was there throughout his life in that human context. Arrests are significant. In East Clare particularly. I mentioned how most of the East Clare Brigade went with the Free State, which is true, but not all. And some significant players took an anti-treaty position, including Cathal Turner on the left-hand side, Pat Houlihan in the middle, and Sean Maroney on the right-hand side. And there are communications from Micheál Brennan describing the urgency of arresting Houlihan and Maroney, particularly Houlihan, because he was one of the most effective IRA officers during the War of Independence. And I suppose Brennan knew that if he wasn't taken out, then East Clare would be more difficult to manage. So after their arrests, you see effectively East Clare quietening down to almost non-activity in the aftermath of their arrests. From October to December, there's little enough activity. partly correlated to obviously the Free State Proclamation and the pastoral letter, but also because I think of the intensity of the fighting that took place across the summer of 1922 and the realisation amongst the anti-treaty IRA that they really were fighting a losing battle. Difficult to get the support. The Free State were increasingly resourced, and Frank Barrett had not left the county, but it's certainly not been contributing hugely to the organisation within that. The other significant moments, and I'm coming towards the end, Pat, are of course executions, which are always significant in the context of the Civil War, and in Clare are no less so. On January the 13th, 1923, Ard-Sullish train station was damaged by a number of anti-treaty Republicans. 3 days later, with the help of an informer, 4 men, including Paddy Hennessy, Con McMahon, who I mentioned earlier, his brother Vincent, and another man called Jack Darcy, were captured in a townland called Lasana in Clooney. And 3 days subsequent to that were executed in Limerick Jail as part of the second phase of executions. Quite significant in that there were leading IRA officers. Quite significant in that it was Micheál Brennan and Austin Brennan that selected them. Peter O'Farrell, a volunteer in Limerick, saw from his window Micheál Brennan and Austin Brennan standing, selecting Hennessy and McMahon within Limerick Jail. The significance is added in the sense that they knew each other intimately. The significance is deepened again by the fact that Paddy Hennessy was at that time the secretary of Clare GAA. He had replaced Tom McGrath the previous year as secretary of Clare GAA. Tom McGrath was Micheál Brennan's second in command. At that meeting was Austin Brennan. So this is the level of intimacy and connection that's playing out during this time. There's very little reference to it in the Clare Champion or in any other paper. And the following year, when a new secretary is introduced, there's no mention made as to why the secretary is being replaced. 2 county boards emerge in the aftermath of that. There's a split within the GA in Clare, which again is evidence of the levels of division that took place. February 23, coming towards the end, it's important to recognise, of course, the effect on the civilian population. One particular individual, Albert O'Brien, was driving a car, a former British soldier, not involved in politics, was driving a car out near Kilfenora and was shot at by Free State forces and shot in the head and killed instantly. There is a memorial, as you can see there, to him between Kilfenora and Innistimon. Mort Maloney, in April of 1923, is one of the last Republicans killed. I was fortunate enough to interview the lady here you see on the left-hand side, Kitty McGough, who was over 100 years of age, and remembered hearing the shot that killed Mort Maloney in April 1923. Again, to emphasise the intimacy of this, he knew the 2 men that were facing him when he was shot. His arms were in the air, and Captain Collins from nearby Corrafin shot him. There was a even closer neighbour, Stephen Foodie of the Free State Forces, was there as well. But Mort Maloney testified before he died that Collins had shot him. So again, I bring that in just as a reference to how close we can get with regard to memory to these incidents. Finally, then. 3 more men are executed in County Clare, and what makes it very significant is that it relates to the last Free State soldier, Private Stephen Canty, who was shot in Ennis in April 1923, on the 21st of April, so over 10 days after Liam Lynch is killed. In the subsequent arrest, Patrick O'Mahony, a former British soldier, an IRA volunteer, and 2 young men, Christy Quinn and Willie Shaughnessy, are also arrested. Paddy O'Mahony is executed on the 26th of April, and even more significantly, Shaughnessy and Quinn are executed on the 2nd of May. And when you consider the timeline of that, it's quite significant and leaves a very, very bitter taste amongst Republicans and many people within County Clare in the context of the date on which those executions take place. So to finish it up, De Valera is arrested in Ennis in fairly sensational scenes in August 1923. And one would think that this is the end of the Republican position in County Clare. And in all of the public pronouncements and all of the public positions, you would find it hard to disagree with that contention. You have as well the reality that the Republicans themselves believe or accept that they're not getting significant support from the population generally. But in the election that followed De Valera's arrest, and of course you can correlate it to that, De Valera gets 45% of the vote. Cumann Gael get less than 20% of the vote. Brian O'Higgins, anti-treaty TD, is also elected. There's my own alarm. Is elected quite easily. So again, to conclude on that point, we have to look beneath and beyond the publicly available information that we have as representative of the experience of any particular county, because the feelings and the emotions and opinions of people are quite often not manifest in public records or in public pronouncements. And I think looking beyond those records into the oral tradition and looking through the records are helpful with us. There are two final people to mention. Dan Crawford, who died as a result of the effects of hunger strike in 1924. There are many of these around the country. The lady on the left-hand side remembered the day he died, and the day he was buried in 1924, when there was a huge thunderstorm in West Clare and Killernan graveyard. And then finally, Nan Hogan, who some of you may have mentioned as well, died in 1925 from the effects of hunger strikes undertaken during the Civil War. The bottom photograph is a painting done for her by Grace Gifford, and the pane of glass on the painting was taken as a cell, or taken from the cell window in Kilmainham Jail. So these legacies, these echoes of all of that period are an insight into all of that experience throughout whatever county you were in. So figures-wise, County Clare can be said to have not played a significant role. I believe 23 anti-treaty IRA men died as a direct result of it. 9 Free State soldiers were killed, 3 were killed accidentally, and 7 Clare Free State soldiers died throughout the country in various different incidents, including many, many accidents. So in total, I think it did play a significant role, but not least for the people of County Clare themselves, where, as in many other counties, it endured in the legacy of the Civil War. So, Gurmila Mahagwith.
Thanks, Tomás, for that. And it gives an insight into the importance of individuals. Civil War, Barrett versus Brennan. And some people would think in Clare that it went on for a long, long time, that politically. For anybody outside of Kerry, the Civil War in Kerry will always have a peculiar fascination. And to talk about that, we now have Owen O'Shea. Owen has written a number of books about Kerry in this period, but he's finishing one, or it's almost ready for publication, on the Civil War in Kerry. And certainly, I think, not just in Kerry, but throughout the country, it'll be looked forward to. So now to deal with Kerry, Owen, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. I would like to thank the organisers of the conference in the first instance for inviting me to present on my native county and its experience of the Civil War. There is a lot I could talk about, but I just have chosen a few topics and themes to give a flavour of my own research. There's practically no disagreement, I suppose, that the conflict in Kerry was more brutal, barbaric, divisive and protracted than perhaps any other county, and I hope to deal with some of the reasons for that in a moment. But before that, I thought it useful to provide a short overview of the conflict in the county, which I've divided broadly into 3 phases. I don't propose to offer a blow-by-blow account of the war, so to speak, given the time constraints, but I suggest the war in Kerry, in what I might call military terms, can be divided into 3 periods: June to September 22, October to February, the winter period, and then March to May 1923. The first engagement of the Civil War in Kerry came 2 days after the assault on the forecourts began, when there was fighting in Listowel. But it was the arrival of almost 1,000 Free State forces in seaborne landings at Feenet and Tarbert at the beginning of August, which triggered the conflict in earnest. The landings included members of the Dublin Guard under Paddy O'Daly and the 1st Western Division under Michael Hogan. The speed and ease with which the army captured Tralee, Listowel and many of the other major urban centres was extraordinary. The army did not have its own way, however, and Republicans gained the strategically important town of Kenmare, which they held until December, and would put up a strong but ultimately failed fight to retain Killorglin. The so-called Battle for Killorglin at the end of September, which resulted in significant destruction of property and disruption to civilians, has been described as the last stand of the IRA during the war in Kerry, in terms of being a significant military engagement. This period of the war was also characterised by ambushes and attacks on the army, particularly in rural areas, as well as extrajudicial killings of prisoners, including, for example, the brutal murder of 17-year-old Bertie Murphy on the steps of the Great Southern Hotel in Killarney at the end of September, at the hands of Colonel David Nelligan. There was also the murder on Inishfallen Island near Killarney of 2 off-duty medical orderlies with the Free State Army who were aged just 18 and 20, which shocked the county. Such incidents at this time highlighted the very young age at which so many combatants tragically died, and indeed, looking at the images of combatants in this period, you realise how remarkably young so many of them were. What can only be described as teenagers just died in significant numbers. While the Free State Army was in full control of the county's towns by the end of September, with the notable exception of Kenmare, they had little or no control in rural areas, particularly in South Kerry on the Iveragh Peninsula. The IRA retreated to the hills and valleys and proved an elusive enemy. Evidence for this is provided in the army reports of the time, held here in the military archives. There are references here, for example, to the, quote, happy hunting grounds for the IRA in rural Kerry. And one report noted that, quote, this country is so difficult and extensive that it affords excellent cover and easy retreat for the irregulars. So over the winter months, we see effectively a standoff almost between the Free State Army in their urban barracks and the IRA in their remote rural hideouts, with a series of individual ambushes, attacks and killings in primarily rural locations and with varying degrees of casualty. The course of the war in Kerry changed considerably in January 23 with the promotion of Paddy O'Daly to the top army job in the county. W.R.E. Murphy, seen there in that group photograph on the right beside Fionn Lynch, was replaced as Major General of the Kerry Command at the beginning of January. O'Daly, a former member of Michael Collins' squad during the War of Independence, as has been well documented, approached the war with determination, vigour and ruthlessness. IRA prisoners in Tralee jail spoke of the screams and shouting that resonated from his office across the yard at Ballymullen Barracks in Tralee during his tenure, as prisoners were brutally tortured. Along with senior officers like David Nelligan and Ned Breslin, pictured here, O'Daly and the Dublin Guard were, as Garrod O'Thuig claimed, the crack core element comprised of the Dublin Active Service Unit and of Collins' hit squad. You could not get a more determined, a more ruthless group sent in to confront the anti-treatyites in Kerry, end quote. Their actions in the county prompted one IRA member to comment that by comparison, the Black and Tans were only a rumour. March 1923, dubbed the Terror Month in Kerry, does not require rehearsing here. Suffice to say that a personal dispute between neighbours in rural Knocknagoshel in the spring of 1923 set in train a series of cataclysmic events which have been synonymous with the worst of the violence and bloodshed of the war in Kerry ever since. Within a few days of the deaths of 5 Free State soldiers in the trip mine explosion at Knocknagoshel on the 6th of March, 17 Republican prisoners were murdered in premeditated explosions in which Free State soldiers planted mines in barricades blocking public roads. The deaths of the 17 Republicans at Ballyseedy, Countess Bridge and at Bahocks near Cahersiveen did more to cement the view in the public mind that elements in the army in Kerry were out of control and had abandoned any pretence of observing the principles of warfare. Moreover, the events of March contributed to the very strong showing electorally of Republican candidates in Kerry in the election just 5 months later, and to this day Ballyseedy, Countess Bridge and Bahocks remain the exemplars of the worst excesses of army brutality in the county during the period. But there was one final epic struggle, as it has been called, when a week after Liam Lynch had been killed and when the war appeared to be coming to an end, a group of IRA members were besieged in a remote rural cave on a cliff face at Clashmelkin, overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. And in the dramatic days which followed, 2 Free State soldiers died, 2 IRA men drowned, another fell as the rope which he was climbing was cut, and another 3 Republicans, including Ned Graney, pictured here, were executed at Tralee Jail. Clashmelkin, which has perhaps been overshadowed by the incidents I mentioned a moment ago, had all the ingredients of the most appalling features of what the war had become in the county. 2 days after those executions, the civil war came to an end. Beyond the specifics of those incidents themselves, what did more to inflame anti-Free State sentiment and buttress Republican support in Kerry were the cover-ups which followed, cover-ups which went right to the top of government. I don't propose to detail each of them here in terms of the events of March 23, but the approach of the government to those incidents can be surmised as insisting that Republicans were removing mines which were planted by Republicans themselves, dismissing the Republicans' versions of events, defending the actions of soldiers in Kerry, and the holding of inquiries which were nothing more than a sham. The extent of those cover-ups were often only revealed in later years, and it was 2008, for example, before the government files in relation to the killing of prisoners at Bohocks were released by the National Archives. Richard Mulcahy would continue to express complete confidence in Paddy O'Daly and his regime in Kerry. Much of the history of the Civil War in Kerry omits what I would call the forgotten war, namely the toll on civilians and on the relatives of the combatants involved. My research on the impact of the conflict on ordinary civilian life in the county highlights the enormous and widespread effects of the war on economic, commercial, community and social activity, something which I would argue has not been fully appreciated or documented heretofore. The level of intimidation, robbery, looting, kidnapping, as well as extensive disruption to transport and communications is revealed in significant part in the compensation claims which are held in the National Archives. The files hold just over 1,200 applications for compensation from individuals and business owners in Kerry who were at the mercy of the general crime and lawlessness which prevailed. The vast majority of incidents are connected to those on the anti-treaty side. An IRA, increasingly unable militarily to undermine the army presence in the county, engaged in other methods which discommoded and impacted civilians as much as it did their enemies in the Free State Army. The theft of vehicles, foodstuffs, clothing, animals, as well as attacks on supporters of the government and their property was widespread. In my home village of Milltown, to cite just one example, shopkeeper James Murphy, a known supporter of Maonaigh, was kidnapped and held by the IRA for 5 weeks and his shop was looted. And this is replicated throughout the compensation claims at the time. Overt or suspected allegiance to the Free State regime brought with it the danger of assault and attack. This was coupled with IRA attacks on railway services, the removal of rail lines, the seizure of mail, the cutting of roads, the destruction of bridges, the seizure of food supplies, and countless other means of disrupting ordinary life. So while the actions of the Free State Army in Kerry, particularly in the spring of 23, provoked the anger and revulsion of the people of the county, so too did the widespread campaign of disruption led by the anti-treaty forces. As the historian Tom Garvin has noted, most will remember or recall the horror of Ballyseedy, but many perhaps forget the relief of many citizens in Kerry when a new army force came to the county to attempt to curb the widespread campaign of disruption and destruction being pursued by the anti-treatyites. The other forgotten aspect of the war, now thankfully no longer forgotten due to the availability of records here in the military archives, is the enormous physical and psychological toll on survivors and their families, as well as the relatives of those who died. The pension applications housed here in this complex betray the truly shocking and barbaric impact on those who sought support from the new state as they endured poverty and hardship, as well as ill health and trauma. There were extensive mental health problems among combatants in the IRA and Conmara, as well as in the Free State Army, with what is now often referred to, what is often referred to in the accounts as neurasthenia, or what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Just to cite one example here, and this is from the sole survivor of the Countess Bridge incident, Ty Coffey. 10 years after he escaped that explosion, a doctor in New York examined Coffey and reported, and I quote, frequent attacks of dizziness, aftermath of beatings received when prisoner of Free State troops, headaches, unable to stand on ladders or any heights without marked tremors, scar on chin and displaced teeth from a butt end of a rifle, history of dizziness, headaches and tremors of frequent occurrence, symptoms of neurasthenia. The case of Army Private Joseph O'Brien, who lost both his legs in the explosion at Knocknagoshel, is particularly tragic and details as a vivid example the physical and mental torture endured by so many for so many years. O'Brien's widow had to repeatedly beg the government for a wheelchair and a commode for her husband, and spent years writing to officials appealing for help. Poverty was endemic among survivors and their families, not just among Republicans, but also among those on the Free State side. In just one example, Michael O'Connell of the Castle Island IRA wrote in his application that "we are near starving. I cannot afford to pay a workman in my stead on my little farm." And this sort of account is replicated across the applications that are held in the military service pension collection. They're just some of the devastating accounts that I think, if you like, illustrate the real impact of the Civil War in County Kerry in the years and decades which followed. Just to briefly reference the casualties in Kerry, for those interested in that data, there were 86 Free State Army deaths in combat and in accidents, while 73 Republicans died, 42 of those in extrajudicial killings. That's according to research by Tom Doyle, Orson McMahon, and some of my own data. The war claimed the lives of 14 civilians, 1/3 of them coincidentally in my home village of Milltown. So why was the war in Kerry so bitter, divisive and protracted? Very briefly, these are some of the main reasons. The remote and rural terrain, which facilitated a guerrilla-style conflict with the IRA having the upper hand in the countryside and the army in control of the towns, was certainly a key factor and did prolong the conflict. The divisions within the IRA, which predated the Civil War, were also a factor during the War of Independence. IRA headquarters believed, mistakenly, it must be said, that the Kerry brigades were inefficient and lazy, and the tensions with Dublin, which were created as a result of that period, were endured thereafter and during the Civil War. Moreover, the presence of so many outsiders among the army in Kerry, so from the Dublin Guard and from the First Westerns, cemented the sense of those not native to the county imposing their might and will on a county on the periphery and far removed from the capital city. The behaviour of many in the senior ranks of the army, as well as the cover-up of some of the most appalling incidents, left a very long, divisive and enduring legacy. As I've argued also, perhaps less known or less appreciated was the campaign of disruption and criminality indulged in by the anti-treatyites, who were hell-bent on making Kerry effectively unpoliceable in their efforts to place Kerry beyond the control of the army. And the toll of the war on civilians, combatants and on the families of combatants, which was profound and long-lasting. In particular, what is most saddening and moving is the extent of nervous breakdown, admissions to psychiatric hospitals, suicide and other traumas usually suffered in private and in silence, which ensured that what occurred and what followed usually went unspoken. It's perhaps no accident then that for so many years the Civil War was not mentioned in political or public discourse in my native county. These things, according to Donal O'Donoghue, a Fianna Fáil TD and anti-treaty IRA member, were, quote, rather gruesome to talk of. The veil of silence remained in place for generations, but I hope that the centenary of these traumatic events will allow an engagement and re-engagement with what happened and why, as Professor Halpin referred to yesterday. Finally, just permit me to mention briefly a 2-day conference we're having in Tralee in February to mark the centenary of the conflict in Kerry and beyond. It's part of the Decade of Centenaries programme, and you'll find more information online. My own book on the Civil War in Kerry will be published by Merrion Press in a few weeks' time. Kerrymen are never shy in self-promotion, as you know, and can be pre-ordered now on Amazon. And finally, if you'd like to find out more about the Civil War in Kerry, my website and social media details are there. And very finally, could I just take the opportunity to acknowledge the tremendous work being done by the staff here in the military archives in providing historians and researchers like myself with access to the stories of those who were at the centre of these events 100 years ago. You have truly done the state a great service, and you deserve our immense gratitude and respect. Thank you.
If we needed any reminder of the horror of civil war, I think Kerry summarised it, and Owen has given us a brilliant summary of the barbarity, the atrocities in Kerry, the reasons behind them, and certainly roll on October in the book. Thank you, Owen. Now, at the other end of the country, almost, we have Louth and Armagh, and to talk about that, we've Donal Hall, Donal has published a number of books on the War of Independence, the Civil War, on that period in Louth, and he's working on one for the four-court series on Armagh. And since it's a county to which I rarely have read or heard about in terms of its War of Independence, and in particular its Civil War record, I am certainly looking forward to hearing Donal about it. Donal, over to you.
Good afternoon. And the good news is that I have no slides. I had a technical breakdown just as I was leaving. So you're going to have to look at me for the next 20 minutes. That's the good news. So one reason why you don't hear about County Louth during the Civil War and the War of Independence period is that no one's written about it. And I was doing research about the First World War period, and I got absorbed into the War of Independence, 1914, 1918. And then I got curious about, well, what happened next? So by default, I started to research the War of Independence, which of course led me on to the Civil War. Louth is terra incognita with a lot of his stories. If it's mentioned at all in the Civil War period, it's in relation to Frank Aiken's spectacular escape from Dundalk Jail in July 1922. But just taken in isolation. And then that's it. You might get a couple of lines about County Louth. In fact, it's a very detailed and very intricate story about what actually happened in County Louth. And the fight that Aiken put up to avoid the Civil War, and ironically, by the end of the Civil War, he was Chief of Staff of the IRA. And he was the most reluctant to join, and he was arguably one of the most effective when he did join in. But in just a bit of background, in mid-21, the IRA was split with divisionalisation between the 4th Northern and the 1st Eastern Divisions. Frank Aiken took control of the IRA in North Louth, Armagh and South County Down. In County Louth as a whole, between North and South Louth, there were about 700 in the IRA at the time of the truce. And by the outbreak of the Civil War, about 900. These were not all Trusseliers. These figures hide the fact that in South Louth they lost about 150 experienced men, while the gain was all in North Louth, where the effects of partition and the spillover of the security campaign waged by the Northern Ireland government was being keenly felt. The truce, in fact, had held fairly well in County Armagh up to February 1922. And then between then and June 22, the provisional government in Dublin engaged in a secret and a not-so-secret campaign to destabilise the Northern Ireland government. There were 27 fatalities in Armagh during this period, 2 IRA, 7 Ulster Special Constabulary and 18 civilians. In all of this, Frank Aiken and the 4th Northern were deeply involved, fighting at the behest of and with the approval of the provisional government. South of the border, Millmount Army Barracks in Drogheda was evacuated at the end of January 22, and two RIC barracks in Drogheda were evacuated in the middle of March. All were taken over by local units of the IRA. But the split in the IRA was already evident when Millmount Garrison was referred to by the local Irish Republican Police as rebels as early as 17th of March, which was 9 days before the IRA convention, where the IRA repudiated the authority of the army authorities and the Dáil. Meanwhile, the 2 other police barracks in Drogheda were taken over by IRA units who continued to take the orders from the GHQ. So already in March, you have a split in the IRA in South Louth. At the end of March, the RIC evacuated Dundalk, and 2 police barracks were taken over by units of the 4th Northern under the command of a Monaghan man called Patrick McKenna. They repudiated the treaty, and significantly, they repudiated the command of Frank Aiken. Aiken had declined to attend the IRA convention. He reasoned that the only outcome would be a split in the IRA, which would eventually lead to civil war, and would be a distraction from the ongoing problems of partition. And he was proven correct. Aiken, he was no fan of the treaty, but he did state that was such were the promises made by Mulcahy and O'Duffy in December 21, January 22, that had he been a TD, he might have voted in favour of it. 2 weeks later, the British Army finally evacuated Dundalk Army Barracks, and they were occupied by Aiken. He moved his headquarters there from Newry, and with about 100 men. And at the time of the outbreak of the Civil War, there were about 300 4th Northern Division men in the barracks and other outposts in Dundalk. After the failure of the Ulster Rising of May 1922, the Northern Ireland government introduced stringent security legislation which allowed for executions, whipping and internment without trial. About 70 men from Armagh county were arrested, but the majority of the 4th Northern escaped across the border into camps which were situated in North Louth and County Monaghan, from where, with the support of the government, they launched attacks, including the notorious attack on Altnavay in June 1922. Aiken himself was offered by Michael Collins, but declined the post of officer commanding of the IRA in Ulster to better coordinate IRA attacks in Ulster. So the point is here that Aiken was deeply involved with the provisional government right up until June 1922. And it was and the forces that he commanded in Dundalk were regarded as Free State forces. And there was an anti-treaty element within Dundalk who were regarded as anti-treaty. But Aiken and his men were regarded as Free State forces, government forces, however reluctantly. So the immediate reason for the outbreak of the Civil War was the arrest on the 26th of June of Leo Henderson from the Four Courts garrison, and he was engaged in seizing goods in pursuit of the Belfast boycott. And the retaliatory arrest of J.J. O'Connell, Assistant Chief of Staff of the National Army. It's not frequently noticed that the Four Courts garrison, when demanding the release of Henderson in exchange for O'Connell, also demanded the release of 5 men who had been arrested in Drogheda, while similarly engaged in enforcing the Belfast boycott. It has puzzled me why Drogheda became a priority target right at the beginning of the Civil War, even while Dublin was still burning. But maybe it was this link that which was made by the Four Courts garrison that determined that there should be an earlier response. On the day of when the attack on the Four Courts opened, executive forces opened up intermittent fire on the National Army in Drogheda, and fighting intensified over the next number of days until on the 4th of July, artillery was brought in and 40 rounds of high explosives were fired at Millmount. The barracks was destroyed, but when the army advanced, they found that it had been abandoned. 2 combatants were killed, 1 from each side and 1 civilian. But the interesting here in relation to this attack is the dog that didn't bark. If, as was subsequently maintained, Aiken was a threat, why did the army not move another 20 miles up the road and secure Dundalk? Because Dundalk was secure. It was in Aiken's hands. But things changed. Aiken had attempted to act as mediator, travelling with the approval of Mulcahy to Limerick, where the threat of fighting loomed. Now I think he was tolerated rather than effective down there, but he absented himself from Dundalk at a crucial period when things were falling apart in Dundalk. There was a mutiny amongst his men in the barrack over non-payment of wages, and so he was 2 weeks away, and by the time he got back, the executive forces had already made their first attacks in the Dundalk area, blowing up railway lines, And when he arrived back in Dundalk from Limerick on the 14th of July, and I quote, "I found there orders to attack the executive forces in my area, and also an order for myself, divisional staff and brigadiers to report to GHQ on Saturday the 15th of July. That night Aiken met with all his officers, and including the executive officers, and they agreed that unless the government gave them a constitutional way for the Republic, that they would give them no support, moral or material. He didn't realise it, but an armed group like that cannot refuse to support the government. If you don't support them, well, then you're against them, especially in a civil war situation. But significantly, they decided to conceal all their arms, and over the next 24 hours, the arms dumps were set up outside Dundalk, and also they agreed that if requested or if demanded, they would hand over all their security points within County Louth. So if the government had handled Aiken properly, they could have walked into Dundalk and there would have been no war, and all this destruction could have been avoided. So on Saturday the 15th, Aiken went to Dublin and they met with his officers, and he met Mulcahy. Mulcahy requested more details as to how the problems could be resolved, and he wanted to present a memo to government. Aiken went back to Dundalk. He wrote the memo that night. He went to bed and he said himself, at 5:30 on the morning of the 16th, I awoke with 2 Thompsons at my nose. Now, the guys holding the 2 Thompson guns were from the 5th Northern Division from County Monaghan under the command of Dan Hogan, an acolyte of Ono Duffy, who had that night infiltrated Dundalk and captured virtually all of Aiken's outposts and men. Hogan had invaded Dundalk, acting under whose orders is still not known for sure, in a well-executed plan. He had his intelligence done, knew where the 4th Northern dispositions were. He had agents operating inside Aiken's headquarters, and he struck at 4 a.m. when the sentries' strength were at a low ebb, and there were 2 casualties, 1 killed and 1 wounded. Now, Aiken was furious at this turn of events. John McCoy, who many of you know who've studied stuff in the archive, his name is all over the place there, a very able adjutant to the 4th Northern. McCoy had avoided arrest, and on Thursday the 27th of July, he mustered what remained of the 4th Northern about a mile from Dundalk. He assembled his men, and at about 7:15 a.m., Ivor Monaghan and Malachy Quinn, who is Rory Quinn's father, the Labour TD, laid a mine outside the perimeter wall on the RD road of the prison, and there followed a very large explosion. There was a hole blown in the wall, and Aiken and 104 men escaped. At the same time, a train was hijacked and driven onto a level crossing near the army barracks, which prevented reinforcements coming from that direction. And troops in the nearby Ann Street barracks went in pursuit. They came under fire from an ambush set up just on the edge of town, where a National Army private, J.J. McCaffrey from County Fermanagh, was killed. McCoy, in fact, was captured during the escape, but Aiken and, like I said, 104 men escaped. And revenge was high on Aiken's agenda, and 3 weeks later, on 14th of August, the day of the funeral of Arthur Griffith, he attacked and he retook Dundalk, together with a massive amount of arms and ammunition. Internal IRA reports claim that they seized 400 rifles and 100 rounds of ammunition. 6 members of the National Army were killed and 9 wounded. It was reported that 30 of Aiken's men were wounded. This was a significant battle. It was impressively organised and executed, like Hogan's before him. Aiken had carefully prepared his ground with a combination of accurate intelligence, surprise, superior firepower. He overwhelmed the army garrison. Todd Andrews, who was present, called this attack the most spectacularly efficient operation carried out by the anti-treaty side in the Civil War. The National Army immediately launched a counter-attack. Aiken had placed barricades mine barricades on approaching roads, and the road from the centre of the town to the army barracks was turned into an extensive killing zone, with mines on the roads and snipers along the rooftops. Aiken was also a realist, and he knew he could not hold Dundalk, especially against an army which had shown itself capable and willing to use artillery in an urban theatre. Aiken was dissuaded from going ahead with a defence of Dundalk by the local clergy. One lorry bomb was accidentally set off in the centre of town, and an innocent passerby who was on his way to work was killed. In late August, it was late August before Aiken actually formally cast his lot in with the anti-treaty side. His bailiwick extended to counties Monaghan, Cavan and Meath, and he could claim that he had 1,050 men opposing 1,600 troops of the National Army. Significantly, half of those troops, about 800, were in County Louth, so it shows the comparative disturbance that there was in the region. In fact, the war in Louth was, to all intents and purposes, over. While there were additional losses on both sides due to ambushes, ad hoc killings and executions, the National Army had the security position under control due to a large part to the quality of its intelligence operations. 3 times in October, the Army had prior information that elaborate raids on Dundalk were planned by Aiken, and 3 times these operations were cancelled at the last minute. Significantly, no, skip that. Followed then was the guerrilla period, if you like, and a set piece ambushes which were significantly absent during the War of Independence. Now people found the capability to carry them out. One which occurred was in September 1922 and the reaction to it is interesting. Patrick McBreen of the National Army died in an ambush in the centre of Dundalk. There was an inquest, and the inquest jury said rather softly, if you like, that they noted that he had died as a result of wounds inflicted by person or persons unknown, and added a pious platitude that these attacks by firearms and sniping should cease. In comparison, the local parish priest deemed the chap's name was McBreen, deemed his killing murder and a dastardly and cowardly crime. Within a week, another soldier was killed, and again a priest condemned this as a brutal and callous murder, and another as a treacherous and cowardly crime. This time, the inquest jury found that the soldier's death was a cruel and deliberate murder. On the 10th of October, after these killings and the reaction by the local parish priest, the Catholic bishops issued their pastoral, which stated that guerrilla warfare now be carried on by the regulars is without moral sanction, and therefore the killing of national soldiers in the course of it, and therefore the killing of national soldiers in the course of it is murder before God. Just want to briefly touch on executions. In January 1923, there was a government decision to decentralise executions. This was to have a devastating effect over the next fortnight. There were 29 executions across the country, and 6 of them in Dundalk. 3 men were executed in Dundalk prison on the 13th of January, and 3 more on a week later. All of these men were charged with having warlike materials in their possession. None of them were charged with actually using it. And some of the warlike materials were pretty pathetic. These guys were caught up in the slipstream of this government initiative to decentralise executions. The shock as a result of these around Dundalk in particular was huge. The night of the second batch of executions, women and girls assembled outside the prison, reciting the rosary and singing. Refusing to disperse, revolver shots and machine gun fire was directed. The immediate reaction to these executions was a series of house burnings. and 7 large houses, if you like, were burnt for the first time really since the whole thing started in 1919. As a result, the executions were blamed. But I have my doubts. Of those houses that were burnt, 3 of them had been selected in an IRA Army intelligence report of late 1921 as being potential enemies to the revolution, and 2 more were prominent members of the Farmers Union who were involved in the bitter dispute with agricultural labourers at that time. My 20 minutes is up. There were 2 phases in the County Louth of the Civil War in County Louth. July and August 1922 was marked with open conflict, first in Drogheda, then in Dundalk. The latter was subjected to 4 major attacks and changed hands 3 times in the short period. After August, there was guerrilla warfare phase with ambushes, attacks on the infrastructure, but which by 1923 had declined perceptibly, and by the time of the ceasefire, the IRA was a pale shadow of its former self, and most members lying low and with 300 of its own men by this stage incarcerated. According to its own figures, it had 110 active men on the roll, of whom 24 were actually in service. This is down from 900, only a few months earlier. They had 320 in jail. They had 41 rifles, 26 handguns, and an assortment of hand grenades, most of them handmade. It experienced the Civil War at its fullest. 60 men died, about 25 each from the National Army and the IRA, and 10 civilians. There was widespread destruction in the infrastructure, especially on the railways. 856 claims for compensation to damage to property were lodged, a total of which matches the combined totals of the neighbouring counties of Monaghan, Meath and Cavan. These claims ranged from cigarettes and turkeys liberated in the name of the Republic, to bank raids, to motor vehicles commandeered by the Army, to train derailments and the burning of mansions. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Donal. And just that phrase that you used, if Frank Aiken had been handled differently, the Civil War in Louth would have been completely different. And it's just how little things matter so much. Another county where there was a contrast between the War of Independence and the Civil War is Wexford. And to talk about Wexford, we have Aaron Maonaigh. Aaron is the historian at residence in Fingal, isn't that it?
No, that's not me.
No, sorry.
I'm a Southsider.
You're not in residence in Fingal.
No.
That you're a Southsider. But anyway, as a Southsider, you're that much nearer to Wexford to talk about it. Okay, Aaron.
The eve of Corjog is Falcher Rove. Every county was different. Indeed they were, and Wexford is no exception to O'Malley's observation. And it's no secret that the county's meagre Tan War record pales in comparison to your Corks or your Kerrys, even your Limericks. And since the end of the conflict, that is the War for Independence, there's been much remark and comment and criticism from both within and without the county, within and outside the county. And when the historian and author Richard de Rochta came to write about the War of Independence in Wexford, he noted that there have been critics, many of whom had taken part themselves in military activities in the county and elsewhere at the time, who alleged that Wexford could have done more, and that some of its leaders were, quote, overcautious, that they'd avoided actions and that might have brought about reprisals upon themselves and their properties. More than 2 decades later, Just Augustine would arrive at many of the same conclusions that the aforementioned critics did. However, when the Civil War broke out in June 1922, The reticence of the previous conflict gave way to a bellicosity that was much more in tune with the county's proud legacy of 1798. Wexford would become one of the most violent counties in the Civil War and was the scene of some of the conflict's bloodiest and most protracted fighting. At least 60 lives were lost as a result of revolutionary violence during the period April 1922 to December 1923, which, just to put that into perspective, is more than double the figure of 23 fatalities, which Ewan and Dahi note occurred during the period January 1917 to December 1921. In spite of the National Army's confidence in a swift and bloodless victory in the southeast, after what we now call the conventional phase, there was a long and protracted guerrilla campaign, which was waged by the local Republicans and continued to blaze long after the flame of revolution had been extinguished elsewhere in the country. So, much as my fellow panellists have noted here today, the pattern of Civil War violence in Wexford can be roughly divided into three distinct phases, beginning with the so-called conventional phase, which was then in turn followed by a return to guerrilla warfare, and ending then with the reorganisation of National Army leadership in the county and the employment of counterinsurgency tactics by that force. The first of the three phases was categorised by the defence, by the IRA, of their positions within the major county towns and villages. Following the defeat of the IRA garrison at the Dublin forecourts and in the West Wicklow town of Blessington, many retreating volunteers made their way southwards through Wicklow and Carla and into North Wexford. Within hours of their arrival, fighting between local IRA units and provisional government troops had begun at Enniscorthy and Ferns. Bolstered by a unit of Tipperary IRA men and the forecourt escapees Ernie O'Malley, Paddy O'Brien and Sean Lamass, the local IRA laid siege to two National Army posts in Wexford, one of which was the castle in Enniscorthy and the other the post office and castle in Ferns. Following some skirmishing, the IRA quickly succeeded in forcing the surrender of the National Army posts at Enniscorthy Castle and the local IRA barracks, as well as consolidating their previously held positions at the courthouse and the Portsmouth Arms, which was a hotel on the banks of the Slaney. However, the deaths of local volunteer Maurice Spillane and Commandant Paddy O'Brien were a heavy price to pay for the concessions extracted from the National Army garrisons. And soon after their deaths, O'Malley and the Tipperary men vacated the town, leaving behind only a token garrison of local volunteers to man the requisition posts. 2 days after the IRA's capture of Enniscorthy, a strong force of pro-treaty troops from Dublin approached Enniscorthy via Arklow and Gordy. Arriving shortly after 3 a.m. on the morning of the 7th of July, lorry loads of troops poured into the town and soon established control. Unable to withstand an attack from such a large force, the small guard of Republicans left behind withdrew after dismantling the RIC barracks and firing the courthouse. The IRA post at Ferns too was taken by pro-treaty troops after a brief exchange. Unbeknownst to the men there, they'd been observed demolishing the main bridge into the village and were subsequently routed by a large force of provisional government troops. Over 30 prisoners, including the brigade adjutant Frank Carty, were captured at Ferns. The fall of Enniscorthy and Ferns prompted the withdrawal of the IRA units from their positions and so marked the end of the conventional phase of the war. Concurrently, the Cork IRA leader Sean Moylan led 230 men on an expedition to Wexford in an attempt to capture the town and from there advance on Dublin, delivering a proverbial Munster uppercut to the heart of the government forces. The plan, in Moylan's own words, was to, quote, finish the Beggar's Bush column here in Wexford before tackling anything else, end quote. However, having arrived at New Ross, Moylan failed to make any meaningful contact with the local IRA. Writing to Ernie O'Malley, he opined, the only method of successfully combating the Free State here is by guerrilla tactics. Small local columns of snipers and obstructionists. I hate leaving here, but I can see no use in having a column here which has no knowledge of the country and who would be blind and useless. End quote. Moylan's band of men left almost as quickly as they had arrived, bringing to an abrupt close any hope of external assistance to the local IRA. Excuse me. The evacuation by Republicans of previously held positions in the towns and villages around the county set in train the second phase of the conflict, that is the move to guerrilla warfare. And this was to become the hallmark of the fighting for the remainder of the conflict in the county. Instructions were issued to IRA units in the field to target the approach roads to Wexford and, where possible, to destroy any bridges in order to prevent National Army advances. In addition, all telegraphs and comms were systematically destroyed and kept out of action. Buoyed by the ease at which they had managed to scatter the local IRA, the Free State forces were confident of swiftly quashing any remaining Republican resistance in the county. Noting their hasty retreat and subsequent regrouping as mobile active service units, a contemporary National Army report commented, quote, "We've no intention of bothering about these. For all the crowds in Ireland, the Wexford Brigades are most assuredly the most pitiful and helpless." End quote. However, their confidence was to be misplaced. Despite early successes against the IRA during the closing stage of the conventional phase of the war, the National Army were to incur great losses throughout the guerrilla phase. The IRA's tactic of wholesale destruction of bridges and railway infrastructure forced National Army troops out onto small local roads, what we call borings, where waiting IRA columns ambushed National Army patrols and convoys at will, causing heavy casualties. For instance, at Cloran on the 24th of July, the IRA, in a failed attempt to rescue prisoners captured at Enniscorthy and Ferns, ambushed the mail train from Wexford to Dublin, resulting in the deaths of 3 National Army soldiers. In October at Ferry Carrick, the IRA hurled incendiaries into a military touring car, resulting in the deaths of 4 further National Army troops and the serious wounding of several others. Isolated postings, such as those at Ferry Carrick and Palace East, were routinely sniped, creating a fraught and lethal atmosphere for the beleaguered occupants. And as we can see from the data here on the slide, which just to give you an indication of the activity in and around the end of September into October 1922. So in the South Wexford Brigade, we have 17 instances of sniping. We have 5 non-fatal ambushes of National Army troops and transport. There was IRA activity noted on all bar 3 days during this period, and there was 1 civilian casualty, which was incurred during the period and occurred on the 8th of October 1922. Spinster named Julia Malloy, who was shot during an exchange of fire between pro and anti-treaty troops near New Ross, and it's been impossible to basically find out from whose gun the fatal bullet was fired, because the IRA were on one side of the river, the pro-treaty on the opposite, and both were firing at each other. And Miss Malloy, unfortunately, happened to be caught in the crossfire. If we look then towards the North Wexford Brigade area, there were only 6 instances of sniping and 2 non-fatal ambushes of National Army troops. There was, however, 1 targeted killing of a National Army officer, Ignatius Redmond, who was executed after being kidnapped near Bunclody in October 1922. Despite their best efforts, the National Army failed to neutralise the threat from local Republicans, and the casualty count continued to climb until the cessation of hostilities. Remarkably, despite nearly daily skirmishing between pro and anti-treaty forces, after the deaths of Spillane and O'Brien during the Battle for Enniscorthy in July 1922, there were no further Republican fatalities, either combat-related or accidental, which occurred in the county until the following January, when Cornelius McCarthy and Bernie Radford of the Murrentown Active Service Unit were shot dead during a firefight with National Army troops. So you can see here the breakdown of Civil War fatalities from 1922. We've got 4 National Army in July, 2 IRA, 1 civilian, and 3 National Army in August, 8 in October, and a further 4 more in December. For all intents and purposes, between the months of July and December 1922, the IRA had free reign of the countryside, attacking National Army patrols at will and inflicting scores of casualties along the way. As Todd Andrews would remark, south of a line between New Ross and Wexford, the writ of the Free State didn't run. Confined to the 2 aforementioned towns, the National Army made occasional sweeps into the countryside. However, owing to the friendliness of the people and the belligerence of the local columns, these sweeps proved costlier than they did effective. In the new year, the IRA turned its attention to the destruction of the county's so-called big houses, paralleling a nationwide upsurge in the destruction of the homes of Free State politicians and their supporters. The campaign, once begun, quickly gathered pace. Bellevue, an elegant 18th century mansion overlooking the River Slaney at Ballyhogue, was the first to be destroyed in January 1923. This was followed by a series of burnings in February, which destroyed Castleborough House, among others. A further 3 big houses, including Ballynastraw House in Gorey, were destroyed in March. At Tegoat, the home of Michael Doyle, a sitting TD and member of the Farmers' Party, was destroyed on the second attempt. So too was the home of Thomas Cousins, a Free State intelligence officer. By the spring of 1923, the situation in Wexford was spiralling out of government control. One senior officer commented, quote, "The military situation at the time was generally unsatisfactory, but the military situation in County Wexford was particularly so," before going on to list several instances of uninterrupted IRA activity in the county during the months of January and February 1923. Citing an incident at Palace East Station on the 3rd of February 1923, the same officer claimed it was the only occasion on which the irregulars were interrupted in their daily work of destruction, although there were at least 950 troops in County Wexford at the time. Even then, the military retired hastily for want of ammunition. It was obvious then that the military situation in Wexford required attention, and to that end, GHQ dispatched seasoned officers Pádraig O'Crahor and Tommy Ryan to the county. They were tasked with overhauling a negligent and underperforming army command, and their arrival heralded a significant change in the government forces' tactics in the area. They formed mobile units of the National Army to counter the Republican active service units. Additional developments included the use of blockhouses in the mountainous regions of the county and the redistribution of National Army posts so as to confine the Republican columns to small areas, leaving no large areas unoccupied by the military, which thus forced the IRA then out into open warfare. I know we're running short on time here, Pat, I'll wrap up soon. These changes to operational tactics would have lethal results for the IRA. Following an unsuccessful attempt to capture a National Army lorry in Coyle in March 1923, members of the local ASU were pursued cross-country before being shot dead by the National Army. In a further attempt to bring the Republican columns to heel, 3 prisoners were also executed at Wexford Jail. The deaths in Wexford Jail, or rather the executions, had failed to have their intended result. They didn't quell anti-treaty resistance in the county, if anything. They kick-started a deadly series of tit-tat killings in the area. In response to the execution, the local IRA abandoned their policy of releasing National Army troops. And they replied in kind with the summary execution of 3 National Army soldiers near Adamstown. Despite attempts to broker a truce between the opposing sides, the column commander, Bob Lambert, was in no mood for negotiations. He warned that if there were further executions, there would be further reprisals. And there were no official executions afterwards. Free State troops patrolling the village of Adamstown shot dead an unarmed IRA volunteer, Michael Furlong, in response to the execution of their own 3 men the previous day. Just to summarise, because I know we're short on time here, is that the trajectory of violence in County Wexford bears many similarities to that which experienced across the territory of the Irish Free State. Where it differed, however, I suppose, was in its ferocity and intensity and longevity. It should be noted that despite the arrest of numerous IRA leaders, coupled with the loss of several active volunteers in the latter phase of the war, that the IRA columns remained at large and continued to exert control over large swathes of the southern half of the county. Unsurprisingly, the number of casualties sustained at any given period broadly corresponds to the sequence of war as it played out in the county, with noticeable spikes consistent with the intensity of clashes between the opposing sides. The opening campaign in the summer of 1922, for instance, and then the National Army attempts to rout the IRA in the spring of 1923, being two obvious cases. It was, in every sense of the words, a war of two halves, one in which the IRA was victorious in the first half of the conflict before conceding to the National Army in the latter half. And although the breakdown of deaths is 49% National Army, 19% civilian, and 32% Republican, we can see here that National Army fatalities, while they were a majority of those who died in the county, they take a significant decline in 1923. And what we note here is the rise of IRA casualties, particularly in March, by those attempts by the National Army to rout the IRA from the south of the county. It's been stated that the conflict was so viciously fought that veterans in 1916 and 1922 or 21 struggled, to understand why Wexford would become so violent, having been so quiet. This can be explained by a number of important factors. During the truce period, the IRA underwent significant reform and training, free from the restraint of an underperforming leadership, many of whom were removed during the truce time restructuring. Younger, more bellicose men rose to positions of influence within the organisation. Secondly, the fallout from the treaty cleaved the Wexford IRA in two, as it did, I suppose, across the country. The North Wexford Brigade under Joe Cummins was nominally pro-treaty, although it contained a sizable number of dissenting staff and indeed battalions. I think it was almost split 50-50, 2 battalions pro-treaty and 2 battalions anti-treaty in the North Wexford Brigade. Whereas the opposite was true of Tomás Súleoine's South Wexford Brigade, which sided by an overwhelming majority with the IRA executive following the treaty split. And the fact that very few South Wexford men broke ranks resulted in an emphatically homogenous IRA unit. Lastly then, the forces of the Free State were hindered by their own command and operational structure, whereby portions of the county were effectively overseen by local commands under the direction of the Dublin Command, who refused to engage with neighbouring commands. As Tommy Ryan would explain in his evidence to the Army Inquiry in 1924, the absence of that mutual support and cooperation, which is so essential in any command, was the refusal of the Gorey garrison to cooperate with the Waterford Command. Gorey was at this time in the Dublin Command, and cooperation between commands had to be arranged by GHQ. And he also noted that despite the inactivity of Republicans in the area, the Gorey garrison had failed to prevent the burning of Sir Thomas Edmund's house at Ballynastrae, yet a mile away. There were also other contributing factors which affected the course and outcome of the conflict in the county, such as the support of the local populace for the IRA, particularly so in South Wexford. And there were other elements. For instance, Tommy Ryan also posited that an IRB connection among locals, as well as the existence of double agents within the local National Army, may have prevented the application of military law in several cases. Combined, the aforementioned reasons greatly contributed to the longevity of the war and its intensity in the county. The effects of the conflict in the county continued well into the closing stages of the war and beyond, with some extrajudicial killings carried out by the National Army after the IRA ceasefire, in addition to a number of deaths attributed to alleged mistreatment and neglect whilst interned. Cora Míle Maonaigh Éisteach ach Sinné. And if anybody would like to get in touch, there's some of my details there. Thank you very much. Thank you.
You'll note that Aaron was very diplomatic in referring to the Sean Moylan and his Cork column local lore always had it that the Cork column in Wexford commandeered everything that they needed and more, so much so that they were described locally as being the true heirs and inheritors of the North Cork militia. On that, which shows you the great sense of history in Cork. Every county was different, and you really heard it. Now, unfortunately, yeah, if there's any questions now from anybody. Yeah, sorry, yep.
This is a question for Owen about Kerry. Where all this activity in the Civil War, where were all these IRA people during the War of Independence? Kerry, certainly compared to its neighbouring county of Cork, was largely inactive in the War of Independence and all. And how much of so much activity was related to embarrassment over that, and also maybe a bit of embarrassment over the fiasco about casement on Bannostrand in 1916?
I think it's unfair to dismiss. I'm by no means an expert on the War of Independence now, but it's unfair to dismiss Kerry's role in the War of Independence as much as it has been, I think. But admittedly, there was a belief in IRA headquarters that the Kerry brigades weren't pulling their weight, and in some respects, that was a justifiable claim. But I think that I think the unleashing of the Civil War divisions then gave sort of an opportunity for some of the Kerry IRA to maybe prove their worth almost, and those divisions really only emerged after June 22. But I think, again, as I referred to in my piece, the arrival of the Dublin Guard and the 1st Westerns kind of from outside the county, and as you know, in Kerry, we don't take too kindly to outsiders coming into the county in any circumstances. But I think that certainly fueled that sort of division with Dublin and tension with Dublin, and by Dublin I mean sort of the administrative capital and so on. So, but it is an interesting point. There is the every county was different piece. There is quite a distinction to some extent between the level of activity during the War of Independence and the Civil War, and that's one of the important features of that period, certainly.
Anybody else? No, I think it is fascinating, this difference between counties. And I think one of the great things that will come out, one of the legacies of this decade of commemoration, will be the quantity and quality, above all the quality of local histories, whether published in terms of a county or a parish or a local company. The quality of those that has emerged is superb. And we've had examples from the 4 speakers here today. Each one of them is an expert in his own county. Each one of them has written or is writing about the county that we've discussed. And I think they've done us a great favour in showing us the localism of the war. And, as was mentioned yesterday by Tim, the localism was a major problem for the anti-treaty forces. But I think it's time that we adjourn for lunch, Daniel. Okay, so once again, thanks to our 4 speakers.